The morning of the wedding arrived under a gray New York sky, heavy with clouds that threatened rain but never delivered. It was October, and the air carried that particular chill that settles deep into the bones, the kind that makes you pull your coat tighter and walk a little faster through the streets of Manhattan. But inside St. Patrick's Cathedral, the cold was forgotten. The ancient church was transformed into a fortress of wealth and power, filled with white roses imported from Ecuador, candles that flickered like 1,000 golden eyes, and marble columns that had witnessed 100 years of prayers, confessions, and secrets. The guests arrived in black cars with tinted windows, parking in a neat row along Fifth Avenue as if even their vehicles understood the hierarchy of the occasion. Men in tailored suits stepped out first, scanning the street with practiced vigilance before opening doors for women draped in designer gowns and family jewels that caught the diffused light filtering through the stained glass windows. These were not ordinary wedding guests. These were the heads of families, the architects of empires built in shadows, the kind of people whose names appeared in newspapers only when they wanted them to, or when someone made a fatal mistake. Inside the cathedral, the atmosphere was thick with tension disguised as celebration. Whispers moved through the pews like wind through tall grass, careful and controlled. Everyone knew what this wedding represented. It was not a union of hearts, but a merger of territories, a strategic alliance between the Mancini family of Manhattan and the Romano family of Brooklyn. For years, these two powerful crime families had maintained an uneasy peace, divided by the East River and mutual suspicion. But recent years had brought new threats, federal investigations that were getting too close, rival organizations from overseas trying to carve out pieces of New York, like vultures picking at a carcass. The old men who sat in smoke-filled rooms had decided that survival required unity, and unity required sacrifice. Isabella Romano understood sacrifice better than most. She sat in a private room adjacent to the cathedral's main hall, staring at her reflection in an antique mirror framed in gold leaf. The wedding dress was a masterpiece of Italian craftsmanship, ivory silk that flowed like water, hand-embroidered with tiny pearls that formed patterns of vines and flowers. It had cost more than most people earned in a year, yet it felt like a costume, something beautiful designed to disguise the truth. Her dark hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, revealing the delicate curve of her neck and the simple diamond necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. Her makeup was perfect, applied by professionals who knew how to make a woman look radiant even when her eyes held no light. She was 26 years old, educated at Columbia University, fluent in 3 languages, and capable of navigating both the legitimate business world and the darker one that existed beneath it. Her father, Vincent Romano, had raised her to understand the family business without being directly involved in its violence. She had grown up in a Brooklyn brownstone surrounded by bodyguards and barbed wire disguised as decorative fencing. She had learned early that certain questions were never asked, certain rooms were never entered, and certain men who came to dinner never came back. But she had also been taught loyalty, the sacred bond of family that transcended law and morality. When her father came to her 3 months ago and explained that she would marry Lorenzo Mancini, she had not cried or protested. She had simply nodded, understanding that this was her purpose, her contribution to the family's survival. Lorenzo Mancini was a legend in the world they inhabited, though legend was perhaps too romantic a word for what he truly was. At 42, he had controlled the Mancini organization for 15 years, inheriting it from his father and expanding it with ruthless efficiency. He was not a man who raised his voice or made dramatic gestures. His power came from something far more terrifying: absolute certainty. When Lorenzo made a decision, it was executed without question or hesitation. When Lorenzo made a promise, it was kept. And when Lorenzo declared someone an enemy, that person learned very quickly that there are fates worse than death. But Lorenzo Mancini carried a wound that no amount of power could heal. 7 years ago, his wife, Elena, had died giving birth to their twin daughters. The details were known to very few, spoken of only in whispers, but the impact was visible to anyone who looked closely. After Elena's death, Lorenzo had become something colder, more mechanical. He still attended his daughter's school events, still made sure they had everything they needed, but there was a distance in his eyes, a wall that no one could penetrate. He had not been seen with another woman since. He had not smiled in photographs. He had not, according to those who knew him best, allowed himself to feel anything that might crack the armor he had built around his grief. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at noon, And as the hour approached, the cathedral filled completely. Every pew was occupied, every space claimed. At the front, Lorenzo's twin daughters sat with their nanny, two 7-year-old girls with their father's dark eyes and their mother's delicate features. Sophia and Julia wore matching lavender dresses and watched the proceedings with the solemn curiosity of children who understand that something important is happening but cannot fully grasp its meaning. They had been told they would have a new mother, someone to take care of them, someone to fill the empty space in their enormous penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park. But they had also been told, in the careful way that children are told difficult truths, that no one could replace their real mother, the woman in the photographs that still sat on their father's desk. The organ music began, deep and resonant, filling the cathedral with sound that seemed to emanate from the stones themselves. The guests rose in unison, a sea of dark fabric and watchful eyes, all turning toward the back of the church. Isabella's father appeared at her side, his weathered face betraying no emotion. Vincent Romano was 68 years old, a man who had survived 4 decades in a world where most men died young or ended up in prison. He had built his empire through a combination of strategic thinking and controlled violence, and now he was giving away his only daughter to secure its future. He offered his arm, and Isabella took it, feeling the strength in his grip, the silent message that this was necessary, that she was doing the right thing. They began the long walk down the aisle, each step measured and deliberate. Isabella kept her eyes forward, focusing on the altar where Father Michael waited in his ceremonial vestments. She could feel the weight of hundreds of gazes on her, measuring her, judging her, wondering if she was strong enough for what lay ahead. Halfway down the aisle, she allowed herself to look at Lorenzo, who stood waiting at the altar with his hands clasped in front of him. He was wearing a black suit tailored to perfection, a white shirt and a silver tie that matched the gray streaks beginning to appear in his dark hair. He was handsome in the way that powerful men often are, not from perfect features but from the confidence that radiates from someone who has never had to question their place in the world. But as Isabella drew closer, she could see the lines around his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped each other just slightly too tightly. This was not a man celebrating. This was a man fulfilling an obligation. When Isabella reached the altar, her father placed her hand in Lorenzo's. The touch was brief, formal, but Isabella felt the coldness of his skin, as if no amount of warmth could penetrate. Lorenzo's eyes met hers for just a moment, and in that glance, she saw what she had expected to see. Nothing. No interest, no curiosity, no acknowledgement of her as anything more than a necessary component of a business arrangement. Father Michael began the ceremony, his voice practiced and smooth, speaking words that had been spoken in this cathedral for over a century. He talked about marriage as a sacred bond, about love and commitment, about the joining of two souls. The irony was not lost on anyone present. This was not a marriage in the traditional sense. This was a treaty signed in silk and flowers, witnessed by men who understood that love was a luxury they could not afford. The ceremony proceeded according to script. There were readings from Scripture, though Isabella barely heard them. There were prayers, though she wondered if prayers spoken in a place like this, surrounded by so much blood money and moral compromise, ever reached heaven. And then came the exchange of rings, heavy bands of platinum that felt like shackles as Lorenzo slid one onto her finger with mechanical precision. Father Michael smiled, that professional smile of clergy who have performed too many ceremonies, and spoke the words everyone was waiting for. "You may kiss the bride." The cathedral fell completely silent. Even the small sounds that always exist in large spaces, the rustle of fabric, the clearing of throats, the whisper of breath, seemed to stop. Everyone understood that this moment, this kiss, was the seal on the agreement, the public acknowledgement that the merger was complete. Lorenzo stepped closer, and for the first time Isabella could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle with notes of cedar and tobacco. He raised one hand to her face, his fingers touching her cheek with surprising gentleness, and then he leaned in and kissed her. It was not passionate or romantic. It was simply a kiss, lips meeting lips, lasting exactly as long as custom demanded and not a second longer. But as he pulled back, Lorenzo leaned in again, his lips nearly touching her ear, and he whispered words that only she could hear, words that cut through all the ceremony and pretense like a blade through silk. "My heart died with the mother of my daughters." Isabella felt her eyes fill with tears that she fought desperately to control. In that moment, Standing at the altar in front of hundreds of people, wearing a dress that cost a fortune and a ring that symbolized everything except love, she understood exactly what her life would be. She would be a wife in name only. She would care for his children, manage his household, appear at his side for public events, and in return, she would live in a beautiful prison with a man who had already decided that his capacity for love was buried in a cemetery in Queens. The organ music swelled again, triumphant and hollow, and Lorenzo took her hand to walk back down the aisle as husband and wife. The guests applauded politely, the sound echoing off the marble and stone, and Isabella forced herself to smile, to nod, to play the role of the happy bride. But inside she felt something breaking, some last piece of hope or innocence shattering like glass. The reception was held at the Plaza Hotel, in the grand ballroom that had hosted presidents and celebrities, society weddings and charity galas. But tonight, it belonged to the Mancini and Romano families, transformed into a display of wealth and power that bordered on obscene. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls of light. Tables were draped in ivory linen and set with china so delicate it seemed to whisper when touched. The centerpieces were arrangements of white orchids and calla lilies, flowers that cost more per stem than most people spent on groceries. A 12-piece orchestra played in one corner, their music sophisticated and understated, designed to enhance conversation rather than dominate it. Isabella sat at the head table beside Lorenzo, smiling for photographs and accepting congratulations from guests who approached in a steady stream. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Expressions of joy for the newlyweds, subtle acknowledgments of what the marriage meant for business, and careful observations of Isabella herself, as if these powerful men and their immaculately dressed wives were trying to determine whether she was strong enough to be the wife of Lorenzo Mancini. Lorenzo himself was polite but distant, shaking hands and exchanging brief words with the men who approached while barely acknowledging Isabella's presence. He did not hold her hand or lean close to whisper comments about the guests. He did not ask if she was comfortable or if she needed anything. He simply existed beside her, a wall of expensive fabric and carefully controlled power. The only moments of genuine warmth came from his daughters. Sophia and Julia approached the head table multiple times throughout the evening, their faces bright with the kind of excitement that children bring to any special occasion. They wanted to show Isabella their dresses, to tell her about the chocolate fountain they had discovered at the dessert table, to ask if she would really be coming to live with them in their apartment. Isabella found herself drawn to them immediately, these two small souls who had lost so much and yet still maintained such innocence. She promised them that yes, she would be there, that she would help them with homework and read them stories and make sure they ate their vegetables. The girls giggled at that last part, and for just a moment, Isabella felt something shift in Lorenzo's expression, some barely perceptible softening as he watched her interact with his children. The dinner was elaborate, course after course of food prepared by chefs who understood that this was not simply a meal, but a statement. There was oysters from Long Island, beef from the finest ranches in Montana, vegetables prepared with techniques that had names in French and required years to master. Wine flowed freely, though Isabella noticed that Lorenzo barely touched his glass, maintaining the absolute control that seemed to define every aspect of his existence. Speeches were made as dessert was served, champagne poured into crystal flutes that caught the light like prisms. Vincent Romano spoke first, his words carefully chosen, talking about family and tradition, about the importance of unity in uncertain times. He raised his glass to Isabella and Lorenzo, and hundreds of guests followed, the sound of crystal touching crystal filling the ballroom like the chiming of distant bells. Lorenzo's response was brief, almost curt, thanking everyone for attending and acknowledging the significance of the alliance. He did not mention love or happiness, or any of the things that might be said at a normal wedding. He simply stated facts, made promises of continued cooperation, and sat down. The subject closed. As the evening wore on and the guests began to leave in the same ordered fashion they had arrived, Isabella felt the weight of exhaustion settling over her. It was not physical tiredness but something deeper, an emotional exhaustion that came from maintaining a performance for hours, from smiling when she wanted to cry, from accepting congratulations for a marriage that felt more like a surrender. At midnight, a car was waiting to take them to Lorenzo's penthouse apartment. It was a black Mercedes with windows tinted so dark that the city lights barely penetrated, driven by a man who had been with the Mancini family for 20 years and knew better than to make conversation. Lorenzo sat on one side, Isabella on the other, the space between them vast despite the confined interior. Neither spoke during the drive through Manhattan streets, still busy even at this hour with taxis and late-night wanderers and the eternal pulse of a city that never truly sleeps. The apartment was in a building on the Upper East Side, the kind of address that appeared in magazines and movies where doormen wore uniforms with gold buttons and elevators required keys to access the upper floors. Lorenzo's penthouse occupied the entire top floor, a space of approximately 8,000 square feet with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered views of Central Park and the glittering expanse of the city beyond. Isabella had visited once before, a brief tour arranged by Lorenzo's assistant to help her understand what she was moving into, but seeing it now, in the context of it being her home, felt entirely different. The interior was decorated with the kind of understated elegance that comes from unlimited resources and professional designers. Hardwood floors in dark walnut, furniture upholstered in leather and silk, art on the walls that looked like it belonged in museums. But despite all the beauty and careful arrangement, the apartment felt cold, more like a high-end hotel than a home. There were no family photographs in the common areas, no small messes or signs of daily life, no indication that two young girls lived here. Everything was perfect, and that perfection was somehow sad. Lorenzo showed Isabella to what would be her bedroom, a spacious suite with its own bathroom and a walk-in closet that had already been filled with her belongings, moved from her father's house earlier in the day. The room was beautiful, decorated in soft grays and whites, with a bed that looked impossibly comfortable and windows that offered a view of the park below. But what struck Isabella most was its location, at the opposite end of the apartment from Lorenzo's master suite, with the living areas and the girls' rooms in between. The message was clear. This was not a marriage that would involve shared space or intimate moments. They would live parallel lives under the same roof, connected only by obligation and the need to maintain appearances. Lorenzo stood in the doorway, his tie loosened, the first sign of relaxation she had seen all day. For a moment he seemed about to say something, his mouth opening slightly as if searching for words that would not come. Then he simply nodded, that same curt gesture of acknowledgement, and spoke in a voice devoid of emotion. "The girls wake up at 7. Breakfast is prepared by the housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, but they like it when someone sits with them. My schedule varies, but I'm rarely here for meals. If you need anything, speak to Robert, my assistant. He manages the household staff and can arrange whatever you require." Isabella nodded, understanding that these were instructions, not offerings of partnership. She wanted to say something, to break through the wall he had constructed, but she could see in his eyes that it would be futile. This was who he had become, and she was simply expected to accept it. "Good night, Isabella." "Good night, Lorenzo." He closed the door, and she heard his footsteps retreating down the hallway, growing fainter, until they disappeared completely. Isabella stood in the center of her new room, still wearing her wedding dress, and allowed herself to cry for the first time that day. The tears came silently, running down her cheeks and dripping onto the expensive fabric, and she did not try to stop them. She cried for the life she had imagined as a young girl, for the possibility of love that had been sold to secure an alliance, for the man on the other side of the apartment who had locked his heart away so thoroughly that he could not even recognize an opportunity for something different. The first weeks in the Mancini household established a pattern that would define Isabella's new reality. She woke early, always before the girls, and spent quiet time in the apartment's library, a room lined with books that looked more decorative than read. She learned the rhythm of the household, the comings and goings of the staff, the preferences of Sophia and Julia, the places where Lorenzo had established routines that were not to be disturbed. The girls became her focus, her purpose in a life that otherwise felt hollow. Every morning she made sure to be in the kitchen when they came down for breakfast, helping Mrs. Chen serve pancakes or scrambled eggs, listening to their excited chatter about school and friends and the small dramas that occupy the minds of 7-year-olds. She walked them to the private school they attended 6 blocks away, holding their hands and making up stories about the people they passed on the street. She attended parent-teacher conferences and dance recitals, sitting in the audience and clapping with genuine enthusiasm when they performed. Sophia and Julia responded to her attention with an openness that broke Isabella's heart. They clearly missed having a mother, someone who would braid their hair and kiss their scraped knees and tell them everything would be okay when nightmares woke them in the dark. Mrs. Chen was kind but distant, a professional caregiver who maintained appropriate boundaries. Isabella offered something different: genuine affection, real interest in their lives, a willingness to be present in ways that went beyond duty. But Lorenzo remained as distant as ever. He left for his office before the girls woke up and often returned after they were in bed. When he was home, he spent time in his study, a room that Isabella had been shown but understood she was not meant to enter without invitation. That invitation never came. Lorenzo was polite when their paths crossed, asking perfunctory questions about the household and the girls. But there was no warmth in his interactions, no suggestion that he saw her as anything more than a very well-paid nanny who happened to share his last name. At night, Isabella lay in her beautiful bedroom and listened to the sounds of the city below, the distant sirens and car horns and human voices that never quite disappeared. She thought about her life before, when she had lived in her father's house and at least had the illusion of freedom, the possibility that someday she might choose her own path. Now she was trapped in luxury, surrounded by beauty and comfort and everything that money could provide except the one thing that mattered: connection. She also began to learn more about the world her husband inhabited, the business that required such strict compartmentalization between his public face and his private actions. Late-night visitors who arrived and left without being announced. Phone calls that Lorenzo took in his study with the door closed and did not speak about afterward. The subtle tension that appeared in his shoulders when certain names were mentioned. The way his eyes would harden at perceived disrespect or challenge. Isabella had grown up adjacent to this world, but living inside it was different. She saw how power was maintained through a combination of generosity and threat, how loyalty was rewarded and betrayal punished, how the entire structure depended on everyone understanding their place and never questioning the order of things. 3 months into the marriage, something shifted. It began with a small incident, almost insignificant in isolation but meaningful in context. Julia came home from school crying, her face red and streaked with tears, and when Isabella asked what was wrong, the girl explained that some older boys had been teasing her about her mother being dead. The words were cruel in the way that children can be cruel, without fully understanding the weight of what they say, and Julia had been unable to defend herself, unsure how to respond to something that was both true and unbearably painful. Isabella held her close, letting the girl cry into her shoulder, and when the tears finally stopped, she spoke quietly but firmly. She told Julia that her mother would always be part of her, that love did not end just because someone died, that it was okay to be sad and angry and confused all at once. And then she added something that surprised even herself, that having a mother in heaven did not mean she could not also have someone here on earth who loved her and would always be there for her, not as a replacement, but as something new, something different, but equally real. Julia looked up at her with red, swollen eyes and asked, "Like you?" Isabella felt her throat tighten, but she nodded. "Like me." That evening, after the girls were in bed, Isabella found Lorenzo in his study, reviewing documents at the mahogany desk that dominated the room. She knocked softly, and he looked up with an expression of surprise, clearly not accustomed to being interrupted in this space. But he gestured for her to enter, and she closed the door behind her, suddenly uncertain about what she wanted to say. She told him about the incident with Julia, about the boys at school and how it had affected his daughter. As she spoke, she watched his face, seeing the way his jaw tightened, the flash of anger in his eyes at the thought of someone hurting his child. When she finished, Lorenzo was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming once on the desk before falling still. "What did you tell her?" he asked finally, his voice carefully neutral. Isabella repeated what she had said about love and loss and the possibility of finding comfort in new relationships without betraying old ones. As she spoke, she saw something change in Lorenzo's expression, some crack in the armor he maintained so carefully. It was barely visible, gone almost as soon as it appeared, but it was there. Vulnerability, grief, and perhaps the faintest hint of gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for being there for them." It was the first time he had acknowledged her contributions beyond the transactional, the first time he had spoken to her as something more than a convenient arrangement. Isabella wanted to push further, to ask him about his wife, about his grief, about whether he would ever allow himself to move forward, but she could see that the moment was fragile, and any pressure might shatter it completely. So she simply nodded and said goodnight, leaving him alone in his study with his documents and his carefully controlled emotions. But as she walked back to her room, Isabella felt something she had not felt since the wedding day: hope. It was small and fragile, easily crushed, but it was there. Perhaps Lorenzo Mancini was not as unreachable as he seemed. Perhaps the wall he had built around his heart had cracks, places where light could penetrate. And perhaps, given time and patience and genuine care for the daughters he loved more than his own life, Isabella might find a way through. Winter came to New York with its usual harshness, transforming Central Park into a landscape of bare trees and frozen paths, the grass brown and dormant beneath occasional dustings of snow. The city took on a different character in these months, the cold driving people indoors and creating a sense of isolation even in the midst of millions. But inside the Mancini penthouse, something was changing, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that was difficult to define, but impossible to ignore. Isabella had settled into her role with a determination that surprised even herself. She approached her responsibilities with the same intelligence and strategic thinking that had earned her top marks at Columbia, treating the household like a complex project that required careful management and constant attention. She learned the schedules of the staff, the preferences of the girls, the unspoken rules that governed Lorenzo's world. But more importantly, she began to introduce small changes, gentle disruptions to the perfect order that had existed before her arrival. She convinced Mrs. Chen to let the girls help with baking on weekends, turning the kitchen into a flour-dusted mess of laughter and chocolate chip cookies. She instituted a Friday night tradition of movie watching in the apartment's home theater, complete with popcorn and blankets, and the kind of comfortable chaos that comes from children being allowed to be children. She brought photographs of the girls into the common areas, framing their artwork and school achievements, adding small touches of life to spaces that had been too perfect, too controlled. Lorenzo noticed these changes, though he said nothing at first. He would come home to find evidence of the day's activities, toys not quite put away or drawings left on the coffee table, and Isabella would watch his face, trying to read his reaction. Sometimes she saw irritation, the tightening around his eyes that suggested he preferred the old order. But other times she caught something different, a softness, a pause as he looked at a photograph of his daughters smiling, a moment of stillness as if he were remembering something long forgotten. The breakthrough came on a night in December, 3 weeks before Christmas. A massive snowstorm had paralyzed the city, shutting down airports and coating everything in a thick white blanket that made Manhattan feel almost peaceful. Lorenzo had been trapped in his office downtown, unable to get home, and had called to let Isabella know he would be staying in the company apartment until the streets were cleared. The girls were disappointed, having planned to show him a dance routine they had been practicing, but Isabella distracted them with hot chocolate and board games, turning the evening into an adventure rather than a loss. By the time Lorenzo finally made it home the following evening, exhausted and frustrated from 36 hours of dealing with business complications created by the storm, he found his daughters already in bed but still awake, waiting. Isabella met him at the door, taking his coat and noticing the tension in his shoulders, the gray cast to his skin that came from too little sleep and too much stress. "They wanted to see you before they went to sleep," she said quietly. "I told them you would come say goodnight even if it was late." "Was?" Lorenzo nodded and walked toward his daughter's room, a spacious suite decorated in soft pinks and purples with bunk beds they had insisted on, even though there was room for separate furniture. Isabella watched him go, then retreated to the kitchen to prepare something for him to eat, knowing he had likely survived on coffee and whatever delivery food could reach his office. 20 minutes later, Lorenzo emerged from the girls' room looking different somehow, less rigid. He found Isabella in the kitchen, setting out a simple meal of pasta with olive oil and garlic, bread from the bakery on Madison Avenue, a glass of red wine. She had not been sure if he would want food or if he would simply retreat to his study as he usually did, but something made her prepare it anyway, acting on instinct rather than established pattern. "You didn't have to do this," Lorenzo said, but he sat at the kitchen island, picking up the fork with what seemed like genuine appreciation. "I know," Isabella replied, sitting across from him with her own glass of wine. "But you look like you could use it." They ate in silence for several minutes, and Isabella found herself studying him in a way she had not allowed herself before. Without the armor of his usual control, exhausted and worn down by stress, Lorenzo looked more human, more accessible. The lines around his eyes spoke of worry and sleepless nights. His hands, she noticed, were scarred in small ways, evidence of a life that had not always been spent in boardrooms and expensive restaurants. "The girls showed me their dance," Lorenzo said finally, his voice carrying a note of warmth that Isabella had rarely heard. "They made me watch it 3 times. Isabella smiled. "They've been practicing for weeks. Sophia is convinced they're going to be on Broadway. Julia told me you've been helping them, that you even taught them some steps from your dance classes in college." Isabella was surprised he knew that detail about her past. It suggested he had paid more attention than his distant behavior indicated. "I minored in dance." It seemed like something worth passing on. Lorenzo was quiet for another moment, then set down his fork and looked at her directly, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I need to apologize." "For what?" "For treating you like you don't exist. For bringing you into this house and then ignoring you except when it's convenient. For making you feel like you're nothing more than a particularly expensive piece of furniture." He paused, seeming to struggle with words that did not come naturally to him. "You've been good to my daughters, better than I had any right to expect, and I've given you nothing in return except a cold apartment and a name that probably causes you more problems than it solves." Isabella felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "I didn't come here expecting anything, Lorenzo. I understood what this marriage was. But you deserve more than what I've been giving you." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration, or perhaps exhaustion. "When Elena died, I decided that the safest thing was to feel nothing, to lock everything away where it couldn't hurt me. And for 7 years that worked. I could function, I could take care of business, I could make sure my daughters had everything they needed. But I wasn't really living, I was just existing, going through the motions, and I told myself that was enough. And now I watch you with Sophia and Julia, and I see what I've been denying them. They don't just need someone to make sure they eat vegetables and do their homework. They need someone who is present, who laughs with them, who makes this place feel like a home instead of a museum." He looked around the kitchen at the small signs of life that Isabella had brought. "You've done more for them in 4 months than I've managed in 7 years. Isabella reached across the counter, her hand stopping just short of his. "They love you, Lorenzo. They talk about you constantly, about how smart you are, how strong, how you can fix anything. You're their hero. But I'm not their father, not really. I'm just a man who makes sure they're safe and fed and educated." "That's not the same thing." "Then maybe it's time to be more than that." Lorenzo looked at her hand so close to his, and something in his expression shifted. It was not love, not yet, but it was recognition, an acknowledgement that she was real, that she mattered, that perhaps the wall he had built was not as necessary as he had convinced himself. "I don't know if I can," he admitted, and the vulnerability in those words was almost painful to hear. "I don't know if I remember how." "Then we'll figure it out together," Isabella said softly. "That's what partners do." The word hung in the air between them. Partners. Not a strategic alliance or a business arrangement, but something real. Something that implied mutual support and shared purpose. Lorenzo studied her face for a long moment, and Isabella held his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to let him retreat back into the safety of emotional isolation. Finally, he reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm despite the cold night outside. It was a simple gesture, skin touching skin, but it felt monumental, a bridge across the distance that had separated them since the wedding day. "Okay," he said. "Partners." From that night forward, the atmosphere in the apartment changed in ways both subtle and profound. Lorenzo began coming home earlier, timing his departure from the office to coincide with the girls' dinner rather than avoiding it. He started asking Isabella's opinion on household matters, actually listening to her answers and implementing her suggestions. He attended the girls' school events with her, and slowly people began to see them not just as a strategic alliance but as a couple, 2 people navigating life together. But the real change happened in the small moments, the spaces between the public performances. Lorenzo started joining them for the Friday night movie tradition, sitting on the couch with Julia curled up on one side and Sophia on the other, while Isabella sat nearby, watching the way his face softened when his daughters laughed. He began having breakfast with them in the mornings, reading the newspaper while the girls chattered, and Isabella made sure everyone ate something beyond sugar and caffeine. He even, on one memorable Sunday, helped with the baking, getting flour on his expensive sweater and somehow managing to burn cookies that were supposed to be foolproof, much to everyone's amusement. Isabella noticed other changes too, small signs that Lorenzo was allowing himself to feel again. He smiled more, not the tight professional smile he used in business, but genuine expressions of humor or pleasure. He touched her more often, casual gestures like a hand on her back when they walked into a room together or fingers brushing hers when he handed her something. He asked about her day, her interests, her thoughts on things beyond the immediate management of his household. He was, slowly and carefully, letting her in. They still maintained separate bedrooms, still led lives that were in many ways independent. Lorenzo's business remained something he rarely discussed in detail, and Isabella respected the boundaries that separated legitimate concerns from the darker aspects of his work. But they were building something, a foundation of trust and mutual respect that felt more valuable than passion or romance. They were becoming friends, partners in the truest sense, two people choosing to support each other not because they had to, but because they wanted to. One evening in late February, as they stood together on the apartment's terrace watching the city lights twinkle in the cold air, Lorenzo spoke about Elena for the first time since their wedding day. He told Isabella about how they met, a chance encounter at a charity gala where Elena had been working as an event planner. He described her laugh, her stubbornness, the way she had refused to be intimidated by his reputation or his power. He explained how her death had destroyed something in him, how he had watched her life drain away while doctors fought to save her and knew that he was losing the only person who had ever made him feel like more than just the sum of his power and his violence. I told myself I would never feel that way about anyone again, Lorenzo said, his voice rough with emotion, because if you never love someone, they can never destroy you by leaving. Isabella stood beside him, close enough that their arms touched, and understood that this was a pivotal moment, a confession that required courage from a man who rarely showed weakness. That's not living, Lorenzo. That's just surviving. I know that now. He turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the city lights. And I know that what we have isn't what I had with Elena. It's different, built on different things. But maybe that's okay. Maybe different doesn't have to mean less. Maybe it can mean more, Isabella said softly. Maybe it can mean building something together instead of just holding on to something that's gone. Lorenzo reached out and touched her face, his fingers gentle against her skin. I'm not ready to call this love. I don't know if I'll ever be ready for that word again. But I want you to know that you matter to me. That this, he gestured between them, whatever this is becoming, it matters. Isabella felt tears prickling her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. That's enough, she whispered. That's more than enough. He kissed her then, not the dutiful kiss from their wedding day, but something real, something that carried genuine emotion even if he could not yet name that emotion love. It was a kiss that acknowledged possibility, that opened a door instead of closing one, that suggested maybe, just maybe, a man who had buried his heart might be ready to excavate it, to dust it off and see if it still worked. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were trembling slightly. Whether from the cold or the weight of what had just shifted between them, Isabella was not sure. But Lorenzo took her hand and led her inside, away from the biting wind, and for the first time since she had arrived at this apartment, Isabella felt like she was truly home. Spring arrived late that year, as if winter was reluctant to release its grip on New York. But when it finally came, it transformed the city with the kind of beauty that makes people remember why they endure the harsh months. Central Park exploded with cherry blossoms and daffodils. The air softened, carrying warmth and the scent of growing things. People emerged from their apartments and offices drawn to the light after months of gray. For Isabella and Lorenzo, the change in seasons seemed to mirror the change in their relationship. What had begun as a thawing on that snowy night in December had evolved into something neither of them had expected, partnership that was slowly, carefully, becoming love. Lorenzo had started small, testing the waters of emotional vulnerability like a man relearning a language he had once spoken fluently. He began telling Isabella about his day, not the sanitized version he had previously offered, but real details, including the stresses and complications of managing a business empire that existed partially in shadows. He introduced her to his closest associates, men who had known him for decades and who studied Isabella with the same careful assessment they would give to any strategic asset. But this time, Lorenzo made it clear that she was not just a political marriage, but someone whose opinion he valued, someone who had earned his respect. Isabella, for her part, continued to focus on making the apartment feel like a home. She organized family dinners where everyone was required to put away phones and actually talk to each other. She convinced Lorenzo to take occasional weekends away from work. short trips to their house in the Hamptons where the girls could run on the beach, and everyone could breathe without the weight of the city pressing down. She even began to understand more about Lorenzo's business, not by asking direct questions but by listening carefully, by piecing together information from overheard conversations and subtle comments, by demonstrating that she could be trusted with knowledge that most people in her position would never be allowed to possess. But the most significant change was in how Lorenzo interacted with his daughters. With Isabella's encouragement and example, he began to truly be present for them, not just as a provider but as a father. He attended every school event, every dance recital, every parent-teacher conference. He helped with homework even when it meant staying up late to relearn math concepts he had forgotten decades ago. He played games with them, told them stories, listened to their problems with the same serious attention he gave to business negotiations. Sophia and Julia blossomed under this attention, their confidence growing as they realized they had not just one but two parents who were genuinely invested in their lives. They began to call Isabella Mom, naturally, without prompting or awkwardness, and Isabella felt her heart expand every time she heard it. These were not her biological children, but they were hers in every way that mattered, and she loved them with a fierceness that surprised her. In May, nearly 8 months after their wedding, Lorenzo suggested they take a real family vacation, not just a weekend in the Hamptons but a full week in Italy, visiting the regions where both their families had originated. It was unprecedented. Lorenzo never took that much time away from business, but he insisted, making arrangements through his associates to ensure everything would be managed in his absence, and Isabella saw it for what it was, a declaration that his family, this strange, cobbled-together family that had started as a strategic alliance, had become more important than the empire he had spent his life building. They stayed in a villa in Tuscany, a restored farmhouse surrounded by vineyards and olive groves, the kind of place that existed outside of time. The girls ran through the fields, their laughter echoing across the hills. Lorenzo and Isabella walked hand in hand through medieval villages, eating gelato and browsing markets, looking like any other couple enjoying a vacation. In the evenings, they would sit on the villa's terrace as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and talk about everything and nothing, hopes and fears, memories and dreams, the kind of conversations that build intimacy more surely than any physical act. One night, after the girls had gone to bed, Lorenzo poured 2 glasses of wine from a bottle produced by the vineyard visible from their terrace. He handed one to Isabella, and then did something unexpected. He began to talk about Elena, not with the raw grief that had characterized his earlier confession, but with something softer, more accepting. He told Isabella about the guilt he had carried, the feeling that he had somehow failed his wife by not being able to save her, by not being able to choose between her life and his daughters' lives when the doctors had told him that only one could survive. He described the years of numbness that followed, the way he had convinced himself that feeling nothing was better than feeling that crushing weight of loss and responsibility. And then he said something that made Isabella's breath catch. "I spent 7 years angry at Elena for leaving me, which I knew was irrational but couldn't help. I was angry at God or fate or whatever force decides these things. I was angry at myself for not being able to fix it, for not being powerful enough to change what couldn't be changed. And that anger kept me frozen, unable to move forward because moving forward felt like betrayal." "And now?" Isabella asked gently. Lorenzo looked at her, his eyes clear in the starlight. "Now I think Elena would be furious with me for wasting so much time. She always told me I was too stubborn, that I held on to things too tightly. She would have wanted me to be happy, to find someone who could be a mother to our daughters, to build a life instead of maintaining a monument to grief. You loved her very much." "I did. And I'll always love her, in the way you love someone who shaped who you are, who gave you the greatest gifts of your life." He reached over and took Isabella's hand. "But I'm learning that loving someone who's gone doesn't mean you can't love someone who's here, that the heart is bigger than we think, capable of holding more than one truth at the same time." Isabella felt tears streaming down her face, unable to hold them back. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying I love you, Isabella." The words came out rough, unpracticed, but utterly sincere. "I don't know when it happened. Maybe it was gradual, building over all these months of watching you with the girls, seeing the way you've transformed our home, feeling the way you've made it safe for me to be more than just the role I play. Or maybe it was that first night when you sat with me in the kitchen and called me a partner. But it's true, I love you. Not because I'm supposed to or because it's convenient, but because you've become essential to my life in ways I can't imagine living without." Isabella could not speak through her tears, so she simply moved closer, wrapping her arms around him and burying her face in his chest. Lorenzo held her tightly, his own eyes wet, and they stayed like that for a long time. Two people who had come together out of obligation, but had found something real, something worth fighting for, something that had healed wounds they had both carried. When they returned to New York, something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer simply partners or friends who were learning to care for each other. They were in love, genuinely and completely, and neither of them tried to hide it. Lorenzo moved Isabella's belongings into his master suite, transforming the space that had been his solitary sanctuary into something shared. They woke up together in the mornings, fell asleep together at night, and in the intimate spaces between, they discovered each other in ways both physical and emotional. The change was visible to everyone around them. Lorenzo's associates noticed that he smiled more, that he seemed lighter somehow, less burdened by the weight he had carried for so long. The household staff observed the way he would seek Isabella out just to tell her something amusing that had happened, or how he would call her in the middle of the day for no reason except to hear her voice. And the girls, perhaps most perceptive of all, saw that their father had finally returned to them fully, no longer trapped behind walls of grief and emotional isolation. In August, nearly a year after their wedding, Lorenzo organized a small dinner party at the apartment, inviting only their closest family and friends. It was not a business gathering or a strategic event, but a genuine celebration, the kind of evening where people could relax and enjoy each other's company without calculation or hidden agendas. After dinner, as guests mingled on the terrace with drinks and the city spread out below them like a carpet of lights, Lorenzo stood and called for everyone's attention. The conversations quieted, and people turned to face him, curious about what the famously private Lorenzo Mancini wanted to say. "A year ago," Lorenzo began, his voice carrying easily in the summer air, "I stood in a cathedral and married a woman I barely knew. It was a marriage of duty, an alliance between families, the kind of arrangement that our world has always relied on to maintain stability and peace. I made that commitment because it was necessary, because it was what my position required, because I understood that personal desires had to be subordinated to larger concerns." He paused, looking directly at Isabella, who stood a few feet away with Sophia and Julia on either side of her. But somewhere along the way, that marriage of duty became something I never expected. It became real. It became the foundation of a family that I'm honored to be part of. And it became a love that I thought I would never experience again, that I had convinced myself I didn't deserve and didn't need. Lorenzo walked over to Isabella, taking both her hands in his. "You took a man who was barely alive, who was going through the motions of existence without really living, and you reminded him what it means to feel. You loved my daughters when you had no reason to, when it would have been easier to simply fulfill the minimum requirements of your role. You were patient with me when I gave you nothing in return, when any reasonable person would have given up or demanded more." Isabella was crying now, but she was smiling too, her face radiant in the soft lighting. "You gave me more than you know," she whispered. "And you gave me everything," Lorenzo replied. He turned back to their guests, many of whom were also showing signs of emotion, these hardened men and women who rarely allowed themselves such vulnerability. "I once told Isabella that my heart died with the mother of my daughters, and for 7 years I believed that was true, but I was wrong. My heart didn't die. It was just waiting, dormant and protected for someone strong enough and patient enough and loving enough to bring it back to life." He kissed Isabella then, in front of everyone, a kiss that was both a declaration and a promise, and their guests erupted in applause. Sophia and Julia wrapped their arms around both of them, creating a family embrace that included everyone who mattered. And in that moment, on a perfect summer night in New York City, the man who had built walls to protect himself from ever feeling pain again, opened himself completely to the possibility of joy. The months that followed were not perfect, because life never is. Lorenzo's business still carried dangers and complications that sometimes kept him up at night. Isabella still had moments of doubt, wondering if she was truly enough for a man who had loved so deeply before. The girls still had hard days when they missed the mother they had never really known, and asked questions that had no good answers. But they faced these challenges together as a family, supporting each other through difficulties and celebrating triumphs both large and small. Lorenzo learned to talk about his fears instead of burying them, to ask for help instead of always having to be the strongest person in the room. Isabella grew into her role not just as a wife and stepmother, but as a true partner in every sense, someone whose counsel Lorenzo sought on matters both personal and professional. And the girls thrived, surrounded by love and security and the knowledge that they were the center of two people's world. On their first anniversary, Lorenzo took Isabella back to the same cathedral where they had married, but this time it was empty, except for the two of them and Father Michael. They stood at the same altar where Lorenzo had whispered those devastating words a year earlier, and this time when the priest invited them to renew their vows, Lorenzo spoke from the heart. Isabella, when I married you, I was a broken man hiding behind power and control. I thought I was protecting myself, but I was really just slowly dying, becoming less human every day. You saved me not by trying to fix me or change me, but by simply being yourself. Strong, patient, loving, and absolutely unwilling to accept anything less than the truth. You gave my daughters a mother, and gave me a reason to believe that happiness wasn't something that only existed in the past. I love you with everything I am, everything I have, and everything I'll ever be. And this time, these words aren't an obligation or a performance. They're a promise freely given that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the gift you've given me. Isabella's response was equally heartfelt, speaking of her own journey from resignation to hope, from simply surviving a marriage to building a life worth living. And when they kissed this time, there were no whispered confessions of death and grief, only the quiet certainty of two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built something beautiful from the ruins of what had been. As they left the cathedral hand in hand, walking out into the bright afternoon sunlight, Isabella thought about everything that had brought them to this moment. The strategic alliance that had become a real marriage, the duty that had transformed into love, the man who had sworn his heart was dead but had learned to feel again. Life, she realized, had a way of surprising you, of taking situations that seemed hopeless and revealing possibilities you never imagined. Lorenzo squeezed her hand, and she looked up at him, seeing not the feared Mafia boss or the grief-stricken widower, but simply the man she loved, flawed and complicated and absolutely perfect in his imperfection. He smiled at her, that genuine smile that still felt like a gift every time she saw it, and together they walked toward the car where their daughters waited, ready to go home. The future was uncertain, as it always is. Dangers still lurked in the shadows of Lorenzo's world, and challenges would inevitably arise. But they would face whatever came together as partners, as lovers, as a family bound not by obligation but by choice. And that, Isabella thought as they drove through the streets of New York toward the home they had built together, was more than enough. It was everything